Living with roommates had always been a balancing act, but up until this summer, it had been mostly manageable. The three of us, Nick, Sarah, and I, had been sharing a decent-sized house in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside the city. We were all in our early 20s, fresh out of college, and trying to figure out our lives. Rent was cheap, the location was convenient, and despite the occasional squabble over dishes or noise, we got along pretty well. Then there was Dan. Dan was our fourth roommate, and he was always a bit of a wild card. He was the kind of guy who had grand ideas but lacked the motivation to follow through. So when Dan announced he was moving out to pursue new opportunities, we weren't all that surprised. What did surprise us was the fact that Dan had decided to sublet his room without telling us. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find a stranger in our living room. He was older than us, probably in his mid-30s, with greasy hair, a scruffy beard, and a general air of dishevelment. He was sitting on the couch, watching TV, and nursing a can of cheap beer. Hi, I said, unsure of what else to say. He turned his head slowly, as if he hadn't even noticed me come in. Hey, he muttered, his eyes glassy and unfocused. I stood there awkwardly, waiting for some sort of explanation, but none came. Finally, I just blurted out, "Are you a friend of Dan's?" The man chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "You could say that. Name's Rick. I'm renting his room." I felt a chill run down my spine. Renting his room? Yeah, Dan and I go way back. He said I could crash here for a while, pay him rent directly. You're cool with that, right? I wasn't cool with that, but before I could say anything, Nick came in from the kitchen, a confused look on his face. "Who's this?" "This is Rick," I explained. Apparently, Dan sublet his room to him. Nick's expression darkened. Did he now? Rick just shrugged and turned back to the TV, as if the conversation was over. Rick settled in quickly, too quickly. He moved his stuff into Dan's old room, a few duffel bags and a battered guitar case, and made himself at home. From the beginning, there was something off about him. He was unemployed, that much was clear. He spent most of his days lying on the couch, blaring Metallica at full volume, or wandering around the house in a daze. He rarely left the house, and when he did, it was always at odd hours, slipping out late at night and returning just before dawn. He never offered any explanation for his comings and goings, and none of us felt comfortable enough to ask. Sarah was the first to voice her concerns. "Does anyone else find it weird that Rick never leaves the house?" she asked one evening as we huddled in the kitchen, trying to avoid the blaring music in the living room. "Yeah, it's weird," Nick agreed, "and he's kind of creepy. I caught him staring at me this morning, just standing in the hallway watching me." I shuddered. I don't like it either, but what can we do? Dan's already gone and Rick's paying him rent. It's not like we can kick him out. "We should have been informed," Sarah insisted. "We didn't agree to this." But for the time being, we were stuck with Rick. We tried to avoid him as much as possible, but it wasn't easy. The house wasn't that big, and Rick had a way of making his presence felt, even when he wasn't in the room. His loud music, his strange habits, the way he seemed to lurk in the shadows, it all added up to a sense of unease that permeated the house. The turning point came a few weeks later when Nick noticed that his guitar was missing. It wasn't just any guitar. It was a vintage Fender Stratocaster, a gift from his grandfather, and one of Nick's most prized possessions. "Have any of you seen my guitar?" Nick asked, his voice tinged with panic. Sarah and I shook our heads. "When did you last see it?" I asked. "Last night. I was playing it in my room. Now it's gone." We searched the entire house, but the guitar was nowhere to be found. Nick was frantic, and Sarah and I were equally concerned. If someone had stolen it, that meant either one of us was a thief, or someone had broken into the house. Then Sarah noticed that her acoustic guitar was missing too. "Okay, this is really messed up," she said, her voice trembling. "Someone's stealing our stuff." There was only one person who hadn't joined the search, Rick. He was in his room, the door shut tight, the sound of Metallica seeping through the walls. Nick pounded on the door. "Rick, open up!" There was a pause. Then the music stopped, and the door creaked open. Rick stood there looking annoyed. "What's your problem?" "Have you seen my guitars?" Nick demanded. "They're missing." Rick scratched his head, looking completely unconcerned. "Nah, man, haven't seen them." Nick wasn't buying it. "I want to check your—" Rick's eyes narrowed. "You calling me a thief?" "We just want to see if you know anything," Sarah interjected, trying to keep the peace. Rick scowled but stepped aside. Nick pushed past him and started rummaging through the room, but there was no sign of the guitars. "See? I told you I don't have them," Rick sneered. "You should really be more careful with your stuff." Frustrated, we left Rick's room, but Nick wasn't convinced. "He took them. I know it." "How can you be sure?" I asked. Nick just shook his head. "I can feel it." A few days later, Nick came to us with news. He had contacted Dan, who admitted that Rick had a history of pawning other people's belongings to pay his bills. Dan had met Rick in rehab a few years back and thought he could help him get back on his feet by offering him a place to stay. But now, it was clear that Rick hadn't changed his ways. "We need to confront him," Nick said, his jaw set in determination. Sarah and I agreed. We couldn't let Rick get away with stealing from us. So that evening, we cornered him in the living room. "We know you took the guitars," Nick said bluntly. We talked to Dan. Rick's face turned pale, and for a moment I thought he was going to bolt. But then he started laughing, a high-pitched maniacal sound that made my skin crawl. "Okay, fine," Rick said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I took them. I pawned them to pay the power bill. You can go pick them up tomorrow." "You what?" Nick exploded. "You pawned my guitar?" Rick just shrugged. "Had to keep the lights on, man. But don't worry, I'll have the rent for you." Eventually, that was the last straw. We called the police to report the stolen guitars, and within minutes, 2 officers were at our door. As it turned out, Rick had a warrant out for his arrest for the same scam in a nearby town. The cops weren't surprised to see him. They confronted Rick as he was frantically trying to pack up his belongings. "You're coming with us, Rick," one of the officers said. Rick was halfway down the stairs with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder when he turned to us and said, "Don't touch my stuff." It was an odd thing to say, considering the circumstances, but we just watched as the police led him out of the house in handcuffs. None of us felt the least bit sorry for him. After Rick was gone, we started packing up his belongings to put them on the curb. Most of it was junk: clothes, old magazines, empty beer cans. But then we found something that made our blood run cold. In the bottom of one of Rick's duffel bags, we found a collection of Polaroid photos. Dozens of them. They were all pictures of us, Nick, Sarah, and me, taken inside the house while we were sleeping, eating, or just going about our day. There were even pictures of us in our most private moments, completely unaware that someone was watching. But the most disturbing part was that Rick wasn't the one taking the pictures. He was in some of them, smiling creepily at the camera, while another person, someone we had never seen before, stood behind him, holding the camera. It became clear that Rick hadn't been working alone. There was someone else out there, someone who had been inside our house, watching us, photographing us without our knowledge. We called the police again, but by the time they arrived, the stranger had vanished. They searched the area and found no trace of him. We never found out who the stranger was or how he had gotten into our house. But the fear of knowing that someone had been watching us, lurking in the shadows, left us all on edge for a long time. We moved out of that house as soon as our lease was up. None of us wanted to stay there any longer than necessary. Even now, years later, I still get chills thinking about those photos and the stranger who took them. Rick had been creepy, but the unknown man behind the camera was something far worse. A faceless predator who had slipped into our lives unnoticed, leaving behind nothing but a trail of fear and unease. It started as a whisper in the back of my mind, a curiosity I had wrestled with for years. In high school, it had been easy to brush off, an odd fascination I convinced myself was just part of figuring things out. But as the years went by, that whisper grew louder, turning into something I couldn't ignore. For the longest time, I believed I was bisexual. I had girlfriends, even loved a few, but there was always something else lingering beneath the surface. I was interested in guys, but not in the way that would make me want to date one. It was more like a need to explore, to try something I had never done before, to see if maybe I was missing out on something. I tried to push the thought aside, but it nagged at me, always there in the background. Finally, I decided to confront it. I needed to know once and for all if this was something real or just a product of my overactive imagination. And so, I turned to Craigslist. It felt weird at first, scrolling through the ads, looking for someone who might be willing to help me out. But Craigslist was full of people with all kinds of desires, and it didn't take long to find someone who was game. We exchanged a few texts, made arrangements, and before I knew it, I was waiting for him in a nondescript parking lot on the edge of town. His car rolled up, a beat-up old sedan, the kind you'd expect to see rusting away in someone's driveway. He rolled down the window and gave me a nod. My stomach twisted with nerves, but I wasn't about to back out. I got in. The car was a mess. Empty fast food wrappers littered the floor, and the air was thick with the smell of stale cigarettes. The guy, let's call him Dan, was older than I expected, maybe mid-40s, with a receding hairline and a paunch that strained against his worn-out t-shirt. He didn't say much, just motioned for me to get to it. I won't lie, I was nervous as hell. My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking as I fumbled with his zipper. But as soon as I started, I knew. I knew in that moment that this wasn't me. There was no spark, no thrill, just a deep sense of wrongness. I pulled away, feeling sick to my stomach. "I can't do this," I muttered, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. Dan's reaction was immediate. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm in a vice-like grip. "What the hell do you mean you can't do this?" I just can't. "I'm sorry," I stammered, trying to pull away. But he wasn't having it. "You think you can just tease me like that and leave? I don't think so." That's when he reached over and flipped the switch on the door. "Child locks," he said with a sneer. "You're not going anywhere." My heart stopped. I stared at him, panic rising in my chest. I could feel the walls of the car closing in, the air growing thicker, suffocating me. I yanked on the door handle, but it didn't budge. I was trapped. Dan's grin widened as he leaned in closer. "Now, why don't you finish what you started?" My mind raced, trying to think of a way out. But all I could focus on was the taste in my mouth, the overwhelming disgust that made me want to gag. I had to get out of there. "Please, just let me go," I begged, my voice trembling. "I won't tell anyone, I swear." But he just shook his head. "You're not leaving until I'm satisfied." I could feel the bile rising in my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to think, had to find a way out. That's when I remembered something, a trick my older brother had taught me when we were kids, about how to get out of a locked car. I just hoped it would work. Slowly, I moved my hand towards the door, pretending to fidget with the handle. Dan didn't seem to notice, too focused on his own twisted desires. With a quick motion, I reached under the door panel, feeling for the emergency release. My fingers found the latch, and I pulled. The door swung open and I didn't waste a second. I shoved it wide and bolted out of the car, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop to look back, didn't stop to see if Dan was following me. I just ran, my feet pounding against the pavement as I darted into the nearest backyard, my only thought to get as far away as possible. I jumped over fences, tore through bushes, not caring about the scratches that tore at my skin. All I could think about was getting away, getting out of there before he caught up to me. Eventually, I found myself in a quiet neighborhood, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, gasping for breath, my legs burning from the exertion. I looked around, half expecting Dan to come barreling after me, but the street was empty. I was safe. For now. I made my way back to my car, parked a few blocks away, and collapsed into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a few tries to get the key into the ignition. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying the events over and over. I could barely sleep that night, the taste still lingering in my mouth, the memory of Dan's twisted grin haunting me. But as the sun began to rise, I forced myself to push it aside. I had to move on, had to forget about what had happened. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness, and I wouldn't let it define me. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. A few days later, I received a text from an unknown number. It was Dan. "Miss me?" The message read, followed by a winking emoji. My heart skipped a beat. How had he gotten my number? I had used a burner phone, hadn't I? I deleted the message, hoping that would be the end of it. But the texts kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. "You can't hide from me, you know. I know where you live. You owe me." I blocked the number, but the messages continued from different numbers. It was like he was taunting me, reminding me that he was still out there, waiting. And then one night I came home to find a package on my doorstep. There was no return address, just my name scrawled across the top in messy handwriting. My hands trembled as I picked it up, a sense of dread settling in my gut. I took it inside, placing it on the kitchen counter, and just stared at it for a long time. I knew I should just throw it away, but something compelled me to open it. With a deep breath, I tore off the tape and lifted the lid. Inside was a phone, an old model that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But it was what was on the phone that made my blood run cold. A video was queued up, ready to play. My hand shook as I pressed the button. The screen flickered to life, showing a shaky video of a car, Dan's car. The camera panned around, and I realized it was inside my neighborhood. My heart pounded in my chest as the video continued, showing the car driving past familiar landmarks until it stopped outside my house. The camera zoomed in on my front door, and then the screen went black. The video ended, but the message was clear. He had found me. I dropped the phone, my mind racing. How could he have found out where I lived? I had been so careful, made sure to use a fake name, a burner phone, everything. But somehow he had tracked me down. I didn't know what to do. The fear that I had pushed aside came flooding back, overwhelming me. I grabbed my keys and ran out to my car, not caring where I was going. Just needed to get away. As I drove through the empty streets, my mind kept going back to that night, to the moment I realized that I wasn't bisexual, that I was straight and terrified. I should have gone to the police, but something in me stopped. Maybe it was the shame, the fear of what people would think, or maybe it was something deeper, a part of me that knew I had to face this on my own. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to calm my racing heart. Finally, as the sun began to rise, I found myself parked outside a familiar house, the house where I had grown up. My parents had passed away a few years ago, and the house had been empty ever since. But in that moment, it felt like the only safe place in the world. I decided to leave everything I owned at my old place and never returned. I don't know what happened to my stalker, Dan, and I don't care. All I know is that I'm free, that I survived. But the memory of that night, the fear that he could still be out there, will haunt me forever. So much so, that I couldn't even drive through that old neighborhood without being terrified out of my mind. And every time I hear a car door slam or see a shadow out of the corner of my eye, I can't help but wonder, will he find me again? When I first met Chris, he was one of those guys you could tell had his life together, at least on the surface. We were in college back then, sharing classes and the occasional beer, but we were never really close. He was the kind of guy who always seemed to have a plan, the type who knew exactly what he wanted from life. After graduation, we lost touch, as people often do. I went on to work in finance, moving into a sleek high-rise apartment, while Chris seemed to vanish. It wasn't until years later that I saw him again. It all started when I came across a Craigslist ad posted by none other than Chris. I wasn't actively looking for it, just scrolling mindlessly as I killed time during a particularly dull day at the office. His name caught my eye, and I was surprised to see him offering a room in his house for rent. The ad was vague, but mentioned something about arrangements and discreet lifestyle. I knew Craigslist was full of sketchy ads, but this one, linked to Chris, piqued my curiosity. I had to know what he was up to. I reached out, more out of concern than anything. The last time I'd seen Chris, He was doing well, working a decent job in the city, living in a nice neighborhood. I couldn't imagine why he'd need a roommate, let alone post an ad with such implications. A couple of days later, he responded, and we agreed to meet up. He was surprisingly enthusiastic, suggesting we catch up over drinks at a bar near his place. When I walked into the bar, I barely recognized him. Chris had lost weight, his face was gaunt, and his clothes hung loosely on his frame. His eyes, once bright and full of life, now looked hollow. I chalked it up to stress, or maybe something deeper, but I didn't pry. At least not yet. After some small talk, I finally asked him about the ad. He hesitated for a moment, took a long sip of his drink, and then sighed. "Yeah, I guess I should explain that. It's not exactly what it seems," he began, his voice tinged with a nervous edge. "I'm renting out a room in my house, but it's more of a companionship thing. You know, someone to help out around the place. And in return, they get free rent. It's not as shady as it sounds." His explanation didn't exactly put my mind at ease, but I nodded, pretending to understand. "So, you've got someone living with you now?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, I found someone. His name's Jake. Good kid. Just needed a place to stay while he figures things out. It's been working out fine." I wanted to believe him, but something in his tone made me uneasy. It was like he was trying to convince himself more than me. The conversation drifted to other topics after that, and we eventually parted ways. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few weeks passed and I didn't hear from Chris. I wasn't too concerned at first. After all, we weren't exactly best friends. But then, out of nowhere, I got a call from an unfamiliar number late one night. "Hey, it's Chris. I need to talk to you. Can you come over?" His voice was shaky, almost desperate. I agreed without hesitation, feeling a sense of urgency I couldn't explain. When I arrived at his place, the house was dark, save for a dim light flickering through the window. I knocked on the door, and Chris answered, looking worse than ever. His eyes were bloodshot, and there were dark circles under them, like he hadn't slept in days. "Thanks for coming," he mumbled, stepping aside to let me in. The house was a mess, clothes strewn across the floor, dishes piled up in the sink, and an overwhelming stench that made my stomach churn. It was a stark contrast to the Chris I used to know, the guy who always kept his space spotless. "What's going on, man?" I asked, trying to mask my concern with a forced smile. "It's Jake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He's not what I thought." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" Chris led me to the living room, where he handed me a crumpled piece of paper. It was a letter, written in shaky, almost frantic handwriting. As I read it, my heart started to race. "Chris, you need to understand. I'm not just some kid you can trick off of. I've been doing everything you asked, being intimate with you for months. I know everything about you. You think you're in control, but you're not. You're just like the others, pathetic, desperate, weak. But don't worry. I'll take care of you. Just like I took care of them." I looked up at Chris, my mind racing. "What the hell is this?" He swallowed hard, his hands trembling. "I don't know, man. We had a normal situationship at first, but then he started getting weird. He'd disappear for days, then show up out of nowhere, acting like nothing happened. I found that letter in my room a few days ago. I don't know what to do." The fear in his eyes was palpable, and for the first time I realized just how deep he was in. I didn't know how to help him, but I knew I couldn't just leave him like that. "We need to call the cops," I said, my voice firm. No cops," Chris insisted. "He's got something on me. I don't know how I let it get this far, but he knows things I can't explain. I just want him gone." I wanted to argue, but I could see the panic in his eyes. Instead, I agreed to stay the night, hoping to keep an eye on things and maybe figure out what was really going on. As I sat there scared out of my mind, "What the fuck have I gotten myself into?" I mumbled under my breath. As the night wore on, the tension in the house grew thicker. Chris paced the room muttering to himself, while I tried to keep my nerves in check. Around midnight, we heard the front door creak open. Both of us froze. "He's here," Chris whispered, his face draining of color. He was terrified of this kid. We sat in silence, listening as footsteps echoed through the hallway. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the sweat on my palms. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside the living room. The door slowly creaked open, and there stood Jake. He was bigger than I expected, his face obscured by the shadows. He stepped into the room, his gaze fixed on Chris. "You shouldn't have done that, Chris, you used me," Jake said, his voice cold and menacing. Chris backed away, fear etched on his face. "I don't know what you're talking about. We had a consensual agreement." Jake took another step forward, his expression darkening. "You think you can just throw me out? After everything I've done for you?" I stood up, ready to intervene. But before I could say anything, Jake pulled something from his pocket, a phone cord. My blood ran cold. "Let's settle this," Jake hissed, his eyes wild with fury. Everything happened so fast after that. Chris tried to run, but Jake was too quick. He lunged at Chris, wrapping the cord around his neck. "Hey, stop!" I shouted, lunging forward to help, but Jake was strong, fueled by some kind of twisted rage. I tried to pull him off, but he knocked me back, sending me crashing into the coffee table. I watched in horror as Chris's face turned purple, his eyes bulging as he clawed at the cord. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the first thing I could find, a lamp, and smashed it over Jake's head. He staggered, loosening his grip just enough for Chris to break free. Chris gasped for air, but Jake wasn't done. He turned to me, his eyes burning with fury. "Are you his new lover?" "You shouldn't have come here, you don't know who he is," he snarled, advancing towards me. I backed away, trying to think of something, anything, to stop him. But before I could react, Chris tackled him from behind, sending them both crashing to the floor. They struggled, and I realized I had to do something, or this would end in a way I couldn't bear to imagine. Without thinking at all, I grabbed the phone cord and wrapped it around Jake's neck, pulling with all my strength. He thrashed, trying to break free, but I held on, tightening the cord until his movements slowed, then stopped altogether. Jake's body went limp, and I released the cord, my hands shaking. Chris and I stared at each other, breathing heavily, the reality of what just happened slowly sinking in. We called the police, knowing there was no other option. When they arrived, they took our statements, but there was something they didn't tell us until later, something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Jake wasn't just some random guy who answered a Craigslist ad. He had a history, a dark, twisted past. He had been in and out of mental institutions for years, and he had a disturbing obsession with people whom he roomed with. He'd find them, learn everything about them, and then worm his way into their lives, using intimacy and their secrets to control them. Chris wasn't his first victim, and he probably wouldn't have been his last. But the worst part? The police found a notebook in Jake's room, filled with detailed notes about Chris and his intimate relationship. I felt so bad for Jake, but that night I vowed to never interfere with another drama. It all started innocently enough. Just another Craigslist ad in the vast sea of online classifieds. I was trying to get rid of an old entertainment center that had been gathering dust in my basement for years. It was one of those bulky, outdated models that nobody really wanted anymore, but I figured someone might still find some use for it. I snapped a few pictures, posted them along with a brief description, and set a price that seemed reasonable. Within a few hours, I got a message from a woman named Linda. She seemed genuinely interested and asked if she could come by to have a look at it. We set up a time for her to come over that evening, around 7 p.m. Everything seemed normal. As the clock ticked closer to 7, I moved the entertainment center into my living room to make it easier for her to inspect. The minutes passed, and I glanced at the clock again. 7:15. No sign of Linda. I sent her a quick text. "Hey, just checking if you're still coming by." No response. By 8 p.m., I had almost forgotten about her, chalking it up to another flake. But then, around 9:30, my phone buzzed. It was Linda. Sorry, something came up. Is it too late to come by now? I hesitated for a moment. It was already late, but I figured, why not? I didn't have anything else planned, and I wanted to get rid of the entertainment center sooner rather than later. No problem, I texted back. Just come on by. Great, I'll be there in 10 minutes, she replied almost immediately. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I began to get that uneasy feeling in my stomach that something wasn't quite right. I sent another text. Are you still coming? Another few minutes went by, and then her response popped up. Yeah, sorry, just a few more minutes. It was now 10:45 p.m., and the neighborhood was completely quiet, the kind of silence that only comes in the dead of night. I was starting to regret my decision to let a stranger come over so late, but before I could think much more about it, I saw a headlight sweep across my driveway. Linda had arrived. I walked to the front door and peered out the window. To my surprise, there wasn't just one person in the car. At least 4 or 5 people inside, their faces obscured by the shadows. I opened the door cautiously and stepped outside. Hi, Linda. A woman exited the driver's seat, waving at me with a smile that seemed too wide and forced. Hi. Sorry, we're late. I brought some friends along to help me out. A chill ran down my spine. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. I counted 5 people in total, including Linda. 3 men and 2 women. They all piled out of the car and started walking towards my house. Whoa, hold on, I said, raising my hands to stop them. I'm not comfortable with all of you coming in. Only Linda can come in, okay? Linda's smile faltered. But they're here to help me. I need at least one other person's opinion. I shook my head, the unease growing. No, sorry. I'm only letting you in. If that's a problem, we can just do this another day. Her expression darkened, and her eyes narrowed as she crossed her arms over her chest. You're not being a very good Christian, you know. The accusation caught me off guard, but I quickly regained my composure. I'm fine with that, I said firmly. Please leave. Linda's face twisted in anger, and she turned to her friends. Let's go, she hissed. This guy's a waste of time. I watched as they slowly retreated to the car, grumbling among themselves. One of the men, in a final act of defiance, started urinating at the end of my driveway. I stood there dumbfounded until they all got back in the car and drove off. I locked the door behind me and went straight to the windows, making sure all of them were securely shut. My heart was pounding, and my mind was racing. Who were those people? What were they planning to do? That night I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside had me on edge. My thoughts kept drifting back to the group of strangers who had shown up at my door. Why did they seem so intent on all coming inside? And why had Linda insisted on bringing them along? Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Whenever I left the house, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the faces of passers-by. I started noticing unfamiliar cars parked in the neighborhood, their occupants sitting inside for hours at a time. Were they watching me? Or was it just my imagination? Then, one evening, I received another message from Linda. Sorry about the other night. Can we try again? I stared at the message, a knot forming in my stomach. The last thing I wanted was to see her or her friends again, but I couldn't just ignore her. I think it's best if we don't, I replied. Good luck with your search. No response. Weeks passed, and I slowly started to forget about the whole incident. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be after something like that. But then, one night, just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I heard a noise downstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then I heard it again, a soft thud, followed by the sound of something scraping against the floor. My heart began to race as I realized that someone was inside my house. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the bed and crept down the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. The living room was dark, but I could see a faint outline of someone standing by the entertainment center. My blood ran cold. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The figure froze, then slowly turned towards me. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw that it was one of the men from the car that night, the one who had urinated at the end of my driveway. "What are you doing in my house?" I demanded, gripping the bat tighter. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled, a slow, sinister grin that sent a chill down my spine. Then he bolted for the back door. I ran after him, but by the time I got outside, he was gone. The only sign that he had been there was the back door, which was wide open, and a small piece of paper left on the doormat. I picked it up, my hands shaking. Scrawled in messy handwriting were the words, "We'll be back." Chapter 6. The final twist. Terrified, I called the police. They came and did a thorough search of the house and the surrounding area, but found no trace of the intruder. I told them about Linda and the group that had shown up at my house weeks earlier, but without any concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. The officer who took my statement gave me a sympathetic look. "You should consider moving," he suggested. "It sounds like these people might be targeting you." The thought of leaving my home was devastating, but the idea of staying and risking another encounter with those strangers was even worse. I started looking for a new place the very next day. A few weeks later, as I was packing up my belongings, I came across an old photo album tucked away in the back of a closet. It was dusty and worn, filled with pictures from my childhood. I flipped through the pages, smiling at the memories, until I reached a photo that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of me, standing in front of the very same entertainment center I was trying to sell. But it wasn't the furniture that caught my attention. It was the man standing beside me, a man I didn't recognize. He was tall and thin, with a sinister grin on his face, the same grin that the intruder had given me before he fled. I stared at the photo in disbelief. Who was this man? And how had he ended up in a picture from my childhood? Suddenly, it all made sense. The reason Linda and her friends had been so insistent on coming into my house, the reason they had targeted me, it was all connected to this man, the man in the photo. But before I could make sense of it, there was a knock on the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I made my way to the door and peered through the peephole. It was Linda standing on the porch, a smile on her face. "Ready for round 2? She asked sweetly. But before I could react, the door burst open, and her friends pushed their way inside. I never stood a chance.